The phone rang at 11:47 on a Thursday night. Nadia Vasquez had been asleep for maybe 40 minutes. The shallow, restless kind of sleep that single mothers know. The kind where part of you is always listening for something to go wrong. She grabbed the phone off the nightstand before the second ring. The screen said, "Marcus." She stared at it for a second. Then she answered, "Marcus." Static, a faint hiss like air moving through a narrow space. And then, barely audible, almost swallowed by the background noise, something that might have been breathing. She said his name 3 more times. Nothing. She hung up and called back. Straight to voicemail. She called again. Same thing. She sat up in bed and tried to remember the last time she had spoken to her husband. It had been, she counted backwards, 6 days. And Marcus Vasquez, 39 years old, auto mechanic, father of 2, had been missing for all 6 of them. The police would later determine that the call came from Marcus's phone. They would confirm the timestamp, the cell tower it pinged from, the duration. 41 seconds. What they could not explain, what nobody has been able to explain to this day, is that Marcus's phone was found the following morning, locked inside the trunk of a car that had been sitting in a storage facility on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada, for the better part of a week. The trunk was locked from the inside, and Marcus Vasquez was inside it too, but he wasn't dead. He was alive, and he didn't remember a single thing. To understand what happened to Marcus Vasquez, you have to understand who Marcus Vasquez was before any of this started. Not the version the news would later describe, not the missing man or the mystery trunk survivor, or any of the other ways the story got flattened and sensationalized when it finally broke. The real Marcus, the one Nadia had known for 14 years. He was the kind of man who fixed things, not just cars, though he was extraordinarily good at that, but things in general. Broken appliances, leaking faucets, arguments that had been sitting unresolved between 2 people who no longer knew how to talk to each other. He had a quality that was hard to describe, a steadiness, a patience. When something was wrong, Marcus Vasquez sat down, studied it, and figured out how to make it right. He did not panic. He did not guess. He understood. Nadia had fallen in love with that quality when she was 24 years old, and her car broke down on the side of Route 395 outside of Reno, in the middle of a July heat that felt like standing inside a mouth. Marcus had pulled over behind her in a pickup truck that was, frankly, in worse shape than her own vehicle. He'd gotten out, walked up, looked at her engine and said, with complete certainty, "It's the alternator. You've got about 20 minutes before your battery dies completely. You want me to call a tow, or you want to drive it to my shop right now while you still can?" He was right. He was always right about mechanical things. What made Marcus unusual as a mechanic, what made his small shop on Vassar Street one of the most trusted in the city, was that he never oversold a problem. He never told you the whole engine needed replacing when it was just the belt. He never inflated labor hours. He had a reputation for honesty that had taken him 15 years to build, and that he protected with a ferocity that surprised people who didn't know him well. By the fall of last year, Marcus and Nadia had been married for 11 years. They had 2 daughters, Sophia, 9, and Camilla, 6. They lived in a split-level house in a quiet neighborhood in the South Meadows area of Reno, the kind of neighborhood where people took their trash cans in the same evening they put them out, where people knew each other's first names, where nothing dramatic had ever happened, as far as anyone could remember. And then, on a Wednesday in early October, Marcus Vasquez kissed Nadia on the cheek at 7:15 in the morning, told his daughters he'd see them for dinner, and drove to his shop. He never came home. By 7 that evening, Nadia was calling his phone. By 8, she was calling his 2 employees, a young mechanic named Dario and an office manager named Beth Caro, asking if anyone had heard from him. By 9, she had called his brother in Sacramento, his 2 closest friends, and the non-emergency police line. Marcus had closed the shop at 6 as usual, according to Beth. She'd been the last one there, and she'd seen him locking up. She'd even waved to him from her car as she pulled out. He'd waved back. That was the last confirmed sighting of Marcus Vasquez. There was no sign of a struggle at the shop. His truck was found parked on the street 2 blocks away, which was slightly unusual. He normally parked in the lot behind the shop, but not alarming in itself. His wallet was inside the truck. his jacket, his lunchbox, still containing an uneaten apple and the wrapper from a sandwich he'd had earlier in the day. His phone was not in the truck. The Reno Police Department assigned Detective Yolanda Ferris to the case on the second day. Ferris had been with the department for 16 years at that point, and she was, by her own description, a systematic person. She believed in building cases from the outside in, starting with the widest possible picture and narrowing it methodically. She did not jump to conclusions. She liked facts. She particularly liked facts that didn't change when you looked at them from a different angle. Very quickly, she found a fact that changed every time she looked at it. Marcus Vasquez had no enemies. Not a single person, not one employee, not one customer, not one neighbor, not one family member could offer Detective Ferris even a hint of someone who disliked Marcus Vasquez enough to harm him. His finances were ordinary. His marriage, by all accounts, was stable and warm. He had no history of depression, substance abuse, or mental health crises. He had no gambling debts. He was not involved in anything illegal. He had never expressed any desire to leave his family, his city, or his life. There was no motive, Detective Ferris would later say. Not for anyone else, and not for Marcus himself. It was like he just, stopped. Not before. By day 4, Nadia had told her daughters that their father was working on something far away and would be back soon. Sophia, 9 and far too perceptive for her own comfort, had looked at her mother for a long moment and said nothing. Camila had asked if she could have extra syrup on her pancakes. Nadia had said yes to both of them, in her own way. She was not sleeping, she was barely eating. She sat with her phone on the kitchen table every evening like a vigil candle, waiting for it to move. And then on day 6, Thursday, 11:47 at night, it did. The call lasted 41 seconds. Static, possible breathing, then nothing. Nadia called Detective Ferris immediately. Ferris was at the station within the hour, and by morning, her team had traced the cell signal. The call had pinged off a tower serving a 2-mile radius that included, among other things, a Sentinel self-storage facility on the edge of an industrial area on the south side of Reno, near the railroad tracks. They went to Sentinel self-storage with a warrant at 8:45 on Friday morning. The facility had 73 units. The managers, a couple named Priscilla and Bart Hollenbeck, had been running it for 9 years. They knew their regulars, they kept meticulous records. And when Detective Ferris showed them a photograph of Marcus Vasquez, Priscilla Hollenbeck said immediately and without hesitation, "That's the man who rented Unit 44. "When?" Ferris asked. Priscilla checked her records. 6 days ago, Wednesday afternoon, around 4 o'clock. Ferris went very still. He rented it himself? Came in alone, paid cash, first and last month. He was polite, quiet. He didn't say what he needed it for. They usually don't. He had rented the unit at 4 in the afternoon. Beth Caro had seen him locking up the shop at 6. His truck had been found 2 blocks away, apparently undisturbed. What had he done in those 2 hours? Unit 44 was a medium-sized unit, maybe 12 by 20 feet, with a corrugated metal roll-up door. The unit was padlocked from the outside when they arrived. Ferris's team cut the lock in under 30 seconds. Inside the unit was a car. It was a 1999 Ford Crown Victoria, dark blue, with a cracked windshield and a dented rear quarter panel. The plates were from Nevada, but the registration, discovered shortly afterward, traced back to an auto auction in Sparks from 18 months prior. The car had been purchased at auction for $430 and had been, apparently, sitting in a private lot since then. It was not a car that belonged to Marcus Vasquez. It was not a car that appeared in any of his financial records, his business records, or his personal documents. There was no one in the front seat. Detective Ferris walked slowly around the vehicle. She noted the locked doors. She noted that the windows were intact, not broken, not cracked beyond the existing windshield damage. She noted the stillness of the car, the smell of the closed unit, the faint but unmistakable smell of something else underneath it. Sweat and something sharper. Fear, if fear has a smell, and anyone who has worked in law enforcement long enough will tell you that it does. She leaned in toward the trunk, and she heard something, a sound, small, almost rhythmic, like a person's chest rising and falling. "Get a Slim Jim on the trunk," Ferris said. "Now." One of her officers reached for the tool, and before he could use it, they heard it, a soft, dull knock from inside the trunk. Once. Twice. Nobody spoke. Ferris said, "Marcus? Marcus Vasquez, if that's you, knock again." 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. "Get it open," she said. "Right now, get it open." What they found when they opened that trunk would later be described in the official report in clean clinical language, the way official reports always flatten extraordinary things into something that sounds almost ordinary. The report said, the subject was discovered in a supine position within the trunk compartment. He was conscious and responsive, no visible injuries beyond mild abrasion to the hands and wrists, no signs of external restraint. The trunk's interior locking mechanism had been manually engaged. Read that last part again. The trunk's interior locking mechanism had been manually engaged. Every Crown Victoria made between 1998 and 2011 has an interior trunk release, a small glow-in-the-dark handle or cord, installed specifically to prevent accidental entrapment. It is a safety feature. It was added to vehicles after a series of tragic accidents involving children. That cord can be used to open the trunk from the inside. But there is a secondary feature. The latch itself can be manually toggled, with some effort, with knowledge of how the mechanism works. Which means that if someone knew what they were doing, if someone, say, had spent 15 years working on cars, knew the internal mechanics of 100 different models, understood exactly where every spring and every lever sat, they could, theoretically, lock the trunk from the inside in a way that couldn't be released without the external key. Marcus Vasquez was a mechanic, and Marcus Vasquez had locked himself inside the trunk of a car and stayed there for 6 days. What nobody could explain, what remains to this day, the central and unreachable mystery of this story, is why. Because when Marcus Vasquez was helped out of that trunk, dehydrated, trembling, blinking at the fluorescent light of the storage unit like a man surfacing from deep water, he looked at Detective Yolanda Ferris and said, in a voice that was barely there, "Where am I?" And then, "How long has it been?" He didn't know. He genuinely, completely, absolutely did not know. Marcus Vasquez was transported to Reno Regional Medical Center by ambulance at 9:22 in the morning. He was dehydrated, significantly, though not yet at the threshold of organ damage. He had lost 11 pounds. The abrasions on his hands and wrists were consistent with repeated contact with a rough interior surface, and forensic examination of the trunk later confirmed handprints on the interior liner, consistent with a person bracing or pushing against the enclosure repeatedly over an extended period. He had food in his system, not much, but some. Granola bar wrappers were found in the trunk, 2 bottles of water, both empty. He had brought provisions. He had planned, at least to some extent, to be in there for a while. His phone was found in the trunk with him. It had 9% battery remaining when they took it from his hands. He did not remember making any calls. Dr. Anika Prabhu, the attending physician, was careful and methodical in her initial assessment. She ran a full tox screen. She ordered neurological imaging. She asked Marcus the standard orientation questions: his name, the date, the names of his children, the name of the president. He answered all of them correctly except one. "What is today's date?" she asked. He said, without hesitating, "Wednesday, October, early October, maybe the 10th? It was Friday, October 16th. He had lost 6 days. He was not confused in the way someone is after a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, Dr. Prabhu would later explain. There was no slurring, no motor deficit, no aphasia. His memory for everything before the Wednesday he disappeared was intact and detailed. His memory for the period between approximately 6 p.m. on that Wednesday and the moment he was found in the trunk, that period was simply gone. It wasn't degraded, it wasn't fragmentary, it wasn't there. The tox screen came back, and here is where the case took a turn that Detective Ferris did not expect. The tox screen was clean. No sedatives, no dissociative drugs, no benzodiazepines, no ketamine, no GHB, no alcohol, No prescription medications beyond a low-dose blood pressure pill that Marcus took every morning. Nothing that could explain the memory gap. Nothing that could explain the behavior. Whatever caused this, Dr. Prabhu said, it wasn't chemical. Nadia arrived at the hospital at 10:15. She had left the girls with her neighbor, a retired school teacher named Gloria, who had appeared at the door the moment Nadia's hands started shaking too badly to finish the sentence she was trying to say out loud. Gloria had taken Nadia's hand, looked at her, and said, "Go." That was all. When Nadia walked into Marcus's room, he looked up at her from the bed, and his face did something complicated. Relief and confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. Something almost like shame. She sat down beside him and took his hand. "Marcus," she said. "I know," he said. "You don't know what I'm going to say." "No," he admitted. "I really don't." She asked him, as gently as she could, what he remembered. And what Marcus Vasquez told her in that hospital room was this. He remembered Wednesday morning. He remembered breakfast. He remembered kissing her. He remembered driving to the shop, opening up, the smell of the garage, the particular quality of the October morning light coming through the windows. He remembered a customer coming in around 11 with a Subaru that had a coolant issue. He remembered lunch. And then, nothing. Not darkness, not unconsciousness, not even a sense of time passing. Just nothing. A gap. Like a sentence with a word removed. Like waking up mid-conversation and not knowing what the conversation was. He did not remember renting the storage unit. He did not remember acquiring the car. He did not remember buying provisions or driving to Sentinel self-storage or locking himself in the trunk. He did not remember the phone call at 11:47 on Thursday night. He did not remember anything at all. "I believe him," Nadia told Detective Ferris when Ferris spoke to her the following morning. "I know him. I have known him for 14 years. He is not lying." "I don't think he's lying either," Ferris said carefully. "But that's not the same thing as understanding what happened." The neurological imaging came back 3 days later. It showed nothing. No lesion, no abnormality, no structural explanation for what Marcus had experienced. An EEG, administered that same week, was equally unrevealing. His brain, as far as every available instrument could determine, was entirely normal. This left Detective Ferris with exactly one avenue she hadn't yet fully explored. She called Dr. Emeka Okafor. Dr. Okafor was a forensic psychiatrist at the University of Nevada, Reno, the kind of specialist who gets called in when cases move beyond what conventional medicine and conventional law enforcement can explain. He was 52 years old, quiet, intensely precise in his language. He had testified in court cases involving dissociative episodes, fugue states, and psychogenic amnesia. He was, by all accounts, very hard to surprise. He met with Marcus Vasquez for the first time 11 days after Marcus was found. The session lasted 3 hours. Dr. Okafor asked questions with the patience of someone who was not in a hurry, and Marcus answered them with the patience of someone who understood that the answers might be important, even if he didn't know why. After the session, Okafor sat with Ferris in a small conference room and said, "Have you heard of a dissociative fugue state?" She had, vaguely. She asked him to explain it like she hadn't. "A fugue state," Okafor said, "is a rare but documented psychiatric phenomenon in which a person, typically under extreme psychological stress, loses access to their autobiographical identity. They may travel. They may perform complex, goal-directed behaviors. They may take on an altered or limited sense of self. And they remember none of it. Not because the memory was physically destroyed, but because the psychological mechanism that records experience was switched off, dissociated. "He didn't seem stressed," Ferris said. "Everyone who knows him describes him as calm, stable." "That's the thing about extreme stress," Okafor said. "It isn't always visible. Sometimes it operates entirely below the surface of conscious awareness. The person isn't aware of how close to the edge they are. And then, it might be something very small, something that wouldn't cause a blink in another person, tips them over that edge. And the mind does something radical. It closes a door, and the person walks through a part of their life that they will never remember." "What tips someone into a fugue?" Ferris asked. That, Okafor said, is what I have not yet been able to determine. Dr. Okafor continued to meet with Marcus weekly. In the second session, he began to explore, gently, with careful therapeutic framing, the period immediately before the disappearance. Not the day of, the weeks before. And slowly, something began to surface. Not a crisis, nothing dramatic, nothing that Marcus himself would have categorized as significant. That was, Okafor would later explain, entirely consistent with the pattern. In the 6 weeks before he disappeared, Marcus had been carrying something. It had started with a phone call. A man named Conrad Fitch had called the shop on a Tuesday in late August, asking about repairs to a 1984 Chevrolet Silverado. Marcus had agreed to take a look. Conrad Fitch, it turned out, was not just a customer. He was a man Marcus had known briefly, and badly, 15 years earlier, before Nadia, before the shop, before the life Marcus had built with such deliberate care. Marcus would not tell Okafor what had happened between them, not in the second session, not in the third. He would not tell Nadia either. He would only say when she asked, "It was before us. It doesn't touch you." But it had touched him. Whatever Conrad Fitch had said or done or brought back with him from that old part of Marcus's life, it had burrowed into Marcus quietly and completely over those 6 weeks. Marcus had not told anyone. He had not altered his behavior in any visible way, not to Nadia, not to his employees, not to his friends. He had gone to work, he had come home, he had eaten dinner with his daughters and read bedtime stories and fixed things that were broken and been, by all external measures, entirely himself. And internally, something had been dismantling. The mind, Okafor explained to Detective Ferris, has a threshold for what it can contain in silence. When that threshold is reached, when the weight of unspoken experience becomes truly unbearable, the system finds another way. For Marcus, I believe the fugue state was a kind of psychological emergency exit. His mind found a way to put him somewhere that nothing could reach him. Ferris thought about that. He locked himself in a trunk, she said. Yes, where nothing could reach him. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said again. There is a detail about the car that no one in the official record has been able to fully account for, and it is the detail that has stayed with everyone who worked this case. The Crown Victoria, the one Marcus had apparently acquired, driven and sealed himself inside, was not a car Marcus had ever worked on. It was not a car that appeared in his shop's records. The auction records confirmed it had been purchased by a private buyer 18 months prior, and the trail between that buyer and Marcus's hands went cold in a way that suggested cash transactions and deliberate obscurity. Someone had gone to some effort to acquire that car quietly. The question was whether that someone was Marcus, acting in a fugue, or someone else. Detective Ferris investigated the possibility of a third party for 5 months. She looked at Conrad Fitch exhaustively. She found a man with a complicated personal history, prior convictions for fraud, a restraining order issued against him in 2019 by a former business partner, but nothing that linked him directly to the storage unit, the car, or the 6 days Marcus had been missing. Fitch submitted to a voluntary interview and denied any involvement. He denied even knowing Marcus had disappeared. Whether Ferris believed him is something she has never publicly stated. What the investigation ultimately concluded was this: Marcus Vasquez had, in a dissociative fugue state, rented the storage unit, acquired the vehicle, purchased provisions, driven to the facility, parked the car inside, and locked himself in the trunk. All of these actions were complex, all of them were goal-directed, all of them required planning, problem-solving, and execution, and he had done all of them without forming a single retrievable memory. The human mind, when pushed past a certain edge, does not break cleanly. It does not shatter like glass. It bends. It finds workarounds. It does extraordinary, terrible, inexplicable things in service of its own survival. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, it runs so far from the unbearable thing that it locks itself in the dark and stays there, and waits. But there is still the phone call. 41 seconds. 11:47 on a Thursday night, from inside a locked trunk, to his wife. Dr. Okafor's explanation for this is, in some ways, the most haunting part of what he found. During a fugue state, he told Ferris, the person is not entirely absent. There is no true unconsciousness. What is suspended is the narrative self, the part of us that organizes experience into story, into memory, into identity. The underlying self, the part that knows who you love, the part that orients toward the people who anchor you. That does not go away. It cannot go away. It is too deep. So part of him knew, Ferris said. Part of him always knew. And that part called her. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Outside the conference room window, the November light was gray and flat and doing nothing to help anyone. In 41 seconds of static, Okafor said, Marcus Vasquez told his wife he was alive. He told her where he was, close enough. He told her there was still something of him that knew her, that reached toward her in the dark. He paused. He couldn't say a word, but he made the call. The question of Conrad Fitch did not go away easily. It did not, in some ways, go away at all. 2 months after Marcus was found, Conrad Fitch left Reno. He did not inform any of the people he knew. He did not leave a forwarding address. His apartment was vacated cleanly. No personal items left behind, utilities cancelled, lease terminated in good standing. He was not a person of interest in any active investigation at that point, and Detective Ferris had no grounds to compel his presence. She noted his departure in her case file. She noted the timing. She did not comment on what she thought it meant. What Marcus had told Conrad Fitch when Conrad came to the shop in August, or what Conrad had told Marcus, never entered the official record. Marcus disclosed it eventually to Dr. Okafor, within the protected confines of their sessions. Okafor confirmed, broadly, that the encounter had reawakened a period of Marcus's past that Marcus had worked over many years to seal off from his present life. He would not say more. He did not need to. The outline of it was visible enough. There are things we bury. We do not forget them. The mind does not truly forget anything. But we become skilled at not looking in the direction of certain rooms. We become so skilled at this that we forget the rooms are there. And then someone comes along, a face from the past, a voice we haven't heard in 15 years, and they stand at the door of one of those rooms, and they knock, and the weight of what's inside comes pressing back against the door all at once. And sometimes the only thing the mind knows how to do is run. Marcus Vasquez returned home on October 21st, 10 days after he was found. He walked through his own front door, a door he had painted himself 3 summers ago, a color called Coastal Fog that Nadia had chosen, and he had told her was perfect and had meant it, and his daughters were on the other side of it. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. She was 9. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stillness. "You're back," she said. "I'm back," Marcus said. Camila said nothing. She just grabbed his hand and held it, the way she had held things since she was 2 years old, with the complete and uncomplicated certainty of a child who does not yet know that some things can be taken from you. The recovery was long, not physical. Physically, Marcus healed quickly. The dehydration resolved. The abrasions healed. He was sleeping and eating and moving through the house within 2 weeks. But the other kind of healing, the internal kind, the kind that has no timeline and no clear finish line, that was slower. Marcus continued to see Dr. Okafor every week for the better part of a year. He began, gradually, to speak about the things he had sealed away, not publicly, not in ways that the official record captured, but to Okafor and eventually, piece by piece, to Nadia. What those things were is not part of this story. They belong to Marcus, to Nadia, to whatever private understanding they have built between themselves. It is enough to know that they exist, that they were real and significant, that they had a weight Marcus had been carrying alone for 15 years, and that he is no longer carrying them alone. There are a few other things worth knowing about how this story ends, or doesn't. Conrad Fitch was located in Portland, Oregon 8 months later. He was interviewed again by Detective Ferris, who made the trip personally. He maintained that his visit to Marcus's shop had been innocent, an old acquaintance looking for reliable car repair. He maintained that he had left Reno because he had a job opportunity, not because of any awareness of or involvement in what happened to Marcus. He maintained all of this calmly, consistently, without visible anxiety. Ferris does not believe him. She has said so, obliquely, to people she trusts. But believing is not the same as proving, and there is nothing in the evidence that gives her what she would need to do anything more than believe. The Crown Victoria was impounded, processed for evidence, and eventually sold at a county auction. It went for $250. It was purchased by a retired firefighter in Fernley who wanted to restore it. He told the county clerk it was in remarkably good condition for its age. Detective Ferris closed the case as a medical incident, dissociative fugue with possible precipitating psychological stressor, and noted in her file that several questions remained unanswered. The file sat in a cabinet in her office for a long time. She told a colleague once that she thought about it occasionally, without intending to, that some cases have a texture to them that other cases don't, a density, a strangeness that resists being filed away cleanly. The part that stays with me, she said, is the phone call, not the trunk, not the car, not any of the procedural stuff, the call. Because whatever he was inside of, whatever fugue or darkness or closed-off place his mind had put him in, some part of him knew to call her. Some part of him knew who she was and reached for her across 6 days and 40 to 1 seconds of silence. She stopped. She looked out the window for a moment. I think about that, she said, and I don't know whether it's terrifying or beautiful. Maybe it's both. Maybe those two things are closer together than we want to believe. Marcus Vasquez is still a mechanic. He still works on Vassar Street, though he has brought on a partner now. A young woman named Priya who has the same quality he has, that diagnostic patience, that willingness to sit with a problem until it tells you what it is. He still fixes things. He does not remember the trunk. He does not remember the 6 days. He has not tried to recover those memories through hypnosis or any other method. And Dr. Okafor has not suggested he should. Some gaps, Okafor believes, exist for a reason. Some silences are the mind's final act of mercy. Nadia still sleeps with her phone on the nightstand. She does not think about this as a habit born of that 6-day winter. She does not frame it that way to herself. She just keeps it there, close, in case it rings, and if it ever does, even from a number she doesn't recognize, even in the middle of the night, even if there is nothing on the other end but static and the sound of air moving through a very small space, she will pick it up. She will keep picking up. There is a thing that happens to us sometimes under enough pressure, in enough silence, with enough unsaid weight inside us. The self fractures, not into nothing. The self never fractures into nothing, but into something unrecognizable. Something that moves and acts and makes decisions and leaves evidence of its passage through the world, but that we cannot claim as our own when we come back. Something that drives to a storage facility at night and locks a car from the inside and curls up in the dark. Something that still knows, even when everything else is gone, exactly who to call. We think of ourselves as single, solid things. We think of our identity as a room we live in, reliable, 4 walls, a door we control. But identity is not a room. It is a system, and like any system, under certain conditions, it fails, it bypasses, it reroutes, it finds emergency exits that its owner did not know existed, and sometimes those exits lead somewhere very dark, and sometimes from the dark we reach out, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, someone picks up. That gap, that small cold gap between the person you know yourself to be and the person you become in the places you can't remember, is where the strange, dark and mysterious lives. And the terrifying truth is that any one of us could be one phone call away from finding it. This story is a work of fiction inspired by real themes. Names, characters and events are fictional.